Dear listener, we have written a book, What's Her Name? A History of the World in 80 Lost Women. After a decade of searching for a world history that was neither a snooze nor a sausage fest, we decided we need to write it.
It's available now in the UK, in Australia, and in the US in December. Wah, wah. But you can pre-order your copy now on our website at what'shernamepodcast.com or anywhere books are sold. This episode is made possible by our Patreon supporters: Monique Tuttle, Julie Gray, Bree Smith, Robin Brown, Janelise Cannon, Jamie Lang, Jill Harrigan, Maria Carla Sanchez, Heather McKinnon, Chantel Oliver, Valerie Jacobson, Lindsay Cummings, and Michaela Frew. You can become a patron for as little as $1 a month and help us create new episodes of the podcast. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Olivia.
We are at a grand ball. Amazing party. Food, dancing, orchestra, over the top everything. And in the center of a group of men is a young woman in a massive ball gown, 18th century hoops and curly cues
and wigs and stuff.
Giant pompadour.
Oh, this is a ball.
This is the first party that has been held in many years because the country has been at war.
Okay.
And this young woman is the absolute center of attention. They are hanging on her every word because so many people want to talk to her. Well, not to her, exactly. Through her.
Through her.
Because she is the only one in the room who speaks all the languages being used in the room. And she is translating back and forth between a couple of American journalists, a bunch of German military officers and businessmen, French, Dutch, Swiss, Norwegian, but mostly German.
Okay, 18th century American journalists. So are we talking like John Adams and Benjamin Franklin trying to get money for the revolution?
Ah, good point. No, because she is in an 18th century ball gown, but we are actually in 1918. This is a costume ball. Celebrating the end of World War I in Berlin, Germany.
Okay.
The young woman at the center of this huddle is named Sigrid Schultz, and she is the reason that these American journalists are at the party. But although they have come to speak specifically to her, they won't actually hear anything from her because she will be the conduit through which all of the men who want to speak to the American journalists can ambush them. She has been essentially the bait to get these men to the party. Why do these American journalists care about a random 21-year-old American?
And why is it so hard to get these journalists to the party? That seems out of character for Americans. Especially journalists. They're always at every party.
All of these questions will be answered as we bring back What's-Her-Name fan favorite returning guest, Pam Toler.
Yay!
Author of course, Women Warriors, guest on our episodes about Zenobia and Lakshmi Bai. She has a brand new book just out called The Dragon from Chicago.
Good name.
About this woman, Sigrid Schultz. Great name. Given to her by a rather infamous individual and worn with pride. Sigrid Schultz is one of the first and only female war correspondents covering World War II in Germany for the United States. And she is so much more than that. This is an amazing story. I am so excited to be able to share it with our listeners. And of course, because it's Pam Toler, you know it's going to be a wild, fun ride along the way. I'm Olivia Mickle.
And I'm Katie Nelson.
And this is What's Her Name?
Fascinating women you've never heard of.
I'm Pamela Toler. I write books about kick-ass women for both adults and children. And The Dragon from Chicago is my 10th work of nonfiction. And the short version is it's the story of an American reporter who was one of the first people to tell her readers about just how dangerous the Nazis were.
How Pam Toler found this story is quickly becoming a What'sHerName classic. The sideline rabbit hole random discovery that falls in your lap while you're looking for something else and derails your entire plan.
I first stumbled across the story of Sigrid Schultz entirely by accident. This interesting story shows up on my news feed. An architectural scavenger found 75 glass plate negatives in the attic of a house in a North Side Chicago neighborhood that's now called Ravenswood. They were the kind of photographs that professional photographers used to take formal shots, but these were informal pictures. And most of them were of a woman, a small child, and a really big dog in and around the house where he found the pictures. And it was sort of an interesting historical puzzle to read while I was having my morning tea. And it turned out that the little girl was named Sigrid Schultz. The woman was her mother, Hedwig, and the pictures were taken by her father, Herman, who was a portrait painter who had immigrated to the United States from Norway. But then I hit the punchline. Sigrid Schultz grew up to be a groundbreaking foreign correspondent and possibly the first woman to be a foreign bureau chief for a major American newspaper. I was already working on a book proposal for a totally different woman whose story really needs to be told, but Sigrid just took her pointy little elbows and pushed the other woman right off my desk.
Ah, delightful.
Sigrid just plopped herself in Pam's lap one morning and announced, "Here I am. You're welcome."
And the more I learned, the more fascinated I was. She wasn't just foreign bureau chief. She was the Chicago Tribune's Berlin bureau chief from 1925 to 1941. So if you're thinking that means reporting on the Nazis, you're absolutely right. She crashed through glass ceilings, though that term didn't exist, and she wouldn't have really acknowledged it even if it had. She stood up to Nazis in Germany. She stood up to pro-Nazi sympathizers back home. And she fought against fake news on both sides of the Atlantic. And that term she did use. William Shirer, who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, said that no American reporter was as well informed about what was happening in Nazi Germany as Sigrid Schultz. And there's every reason to believe that was true.
There are several things that made Sigrid Schultz so remarkable as a reporter and a war correspondent. Aside from, obviously, her sex, when women were not war correspondents and not largely reporters at all. The most prominent difference is the very unusual path that she took to becoming a reporter and the very unusual skills that she brought to the job.
It really starts out in Chicago. She was born in Chicago in 1893. Her parents were Norwegian immigrants, and she would always describe herself as being from Chicago, even though they moved away when she was 8 years old, and it was another 40 years before she lived in the United States again. So she's an American by birth, she's American by identification, but she's educated and raised in Europe. Her parents were determined that she would be multilingual even before they moved back to Europe.
So the rule in the house was that little Sigrid had to answer a question in the language it was asked. So if her parents asked her a question in German, she has to answer in German. If they ask her a question in French, she has to answer in French. And it sometimes turns into kind of a party trick. The Schultz family were huge entertainers, and her father would ask her in French, "Please bring the corkscrew." And Sigrid would run off, get the corkscrew, and bring it back and say in French, "Here is the corkscrew, Papa."
But that interest in languages continued. She studied for a short time as a small child in Germany, where she quickly learned that being a trilingual child in Chicago did not mean that she spoke German like a German child. To her horror, she got set back a few grades because she couldn't quite keep up in German. After a brief time in Germany, they relocated to Paris. And once she was able to function in French well enough, she ended up in an important French girls' academy.
She became fluent in both German and French, plus Norwegian and English. She had quite a bit of Italian because that was the language she was learning in school. And she can fake her way through Dutch, Swedish, Finnish,
Lucky.
etc.
Cool. Envy.
I'm always jealous of people who are truly multi-fluent, lingual, because I firmly believe that nothing will make you understand your own culture better than seeing it through a different culture's eyes. I was an English major, but I finally learned grammar in German.
Yeah, same.
And I had to awkwardly raise my hand in fourth year college German and say, "I'm sorry, what's an adverb?" and get laughed out of the room. And just the cultural separation that it gives you to step back to say, oh, my culture is just a culture. It's not the culture. It's a way to be.
The other thing she ends up having is a wide network of sources in Berlin. Her parents moved to Berlin shortly before World War I. She followed them there, and her father's studio was always a social hub. He was just a fun guy, and people flocked to him. So he knew German military officers, he knew German artists, he knew German musicians, he knew barons of industry. So he had this wide base that she was going to build on.
So Sigrid is just becoming an adult. She's meeting all these fascinating people. She's right in the middle of everything, and she has her finger on the pulse of everything that's happening. And then World War I happens. They are enemy aliens in a country at war with America.
The embassy warns her mother that they need to leave.
But they can't. Her parents are too ill to leave. They're stuck, so she is stuck. She can't leave her parents alone in a foreign country. So Sigrid becomes the sole financial support for herself and both of her parents. And she has to cobble together an income with whatever she can come up with, which is mostly her language skills. She is not allowed to be working. She's not supposed to leave her neighborhood without permission. But she has all of her father's contacts, and all of these very wealthy Germans are very interested in learning English and French. So she is doing lots of private tutoring. She works for the Belgian embassy, doing translation. She's just coming up with whatever she can do to keep them mostly fed and alive.
And then she ends up with this really interesting side job that she just is perfect for.
A Turkish diplomat, the former mayor of Baghdad, didn't want to be stuck in Baghdad, so he moves to Germany.
He was a political scientist, and he wanted to study political science and law at the university in Berlin while he was in Berlin, but he didn't speak German. So he advertised for someone who was fluent in French and in German and had control of the technical language of political science and law. Sigrid did, because for a short time she studied unofficially at the Sorbonne, specifically studied history and law. So she had the vocabulary, she had the languages.
She answers the advertisement thinking, okay, this is going to be a translation job. And it is, kind of. What he is asking her to do is to attend all of his law and political science classes for him in the morning in German with a fake ID because she is not allowed to be there. She's an enemy alien. And then go to his office in the afternoon and report the entire lecture to him in French and discuss it all with him in French.
Wow. Okay.
He just wants to learn the information, so he is attending school by proxy through Sigrid Schultz.
Wow. What a cool way to go to school for both of them.
Yeah, I mean, amazing.
Like, think how much you would digest that information if you learn it, and then you have to turn it into a different language and report
Immediately,
it.
yes.
Yeah,
you're teaching it the
Building
same
those
day.
neural pathways,
Yeah.
double time. Awesome.
And, when she would otherwise be stuck in an apartment doing nothing, this is a pretty good way to spend the war. He is, in fact, so impressed with her abilities here that he starts hiring her to translate for him in all of his important meetings.
So he's got German newspaper editors. He's got German industrialists. He has Turkish military men who are in Berlin buying military equipment for the Turkish army. Lots of important men. And she's there translating between German and French because she's the only one in the room who speaks both languages.
So she gets a formal education in law and political science and an informal education in international diplomacy, business, and schmoozing.
Wow, what an opportunity.
And she gets to add more people to her network. So now she has her father's entire network of influential and important people. And now she has the mayor of Baghdad's entire network of important and influential people.
She's getting to know people at every level of German society.
And this is how she spends the war.
They did not intern Americans, partially because there weren't that many of them there, but they kept them on a short reign. So she and her mother had to go to the police station in the neighborhood twice a day to have their control card stamped. And they weren't supposed to leave the neighborhood. She left all the time. She had to leave to go teach her students. She had to leave to go to the university where she wasn't allowed anyway. She had to leave to go to the Turkish diplomat's office. And one way they got around that was they bribed the police chief from her father's really, 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 really good cigars. By the end of the war, she has a network base of sources. She is fluent in many languages, and she stumbles into journalism totally unexpectedly. It's early 1919, and the older brother of one of her students throws a carnival party. It's the first big society party since the end of the war. The brother is a banker, and he and his business friends really want to talk to the American reporters who are starting to come into Berlin after the war and are starting to set up news bureaus, which really didn't exist before World War I.
The banker man has told all of these American reporters that if they come to his party, they will be able to talk to a young American woman who had lived in Berlin all through the war and through the revolution after the war that founded the Weimar Republic, through all of the riots. She had been there for all of it, and she can give them an American perspective from inside the war. This is very exciting, and two of the reporters who accept are Dick Little, the first bureau chief of the Chicago Tribune, unfortunate name, and his counterpart at the Chicago Daily News.
Sigrid's coming to this party, and nasty out, and the public transportation isn't running, and there's the beginnings of what will be a serious set of riots in a couple of days. And she doesn't care. She's walking in the dark through, men with guns, because she's going to be there, and she's got her beautiful 18th century style dress because it's a costume party, and her hair's all up in a pompadour.
She's so excited. She's going to dance for the first time in years. She's going to have great food. It's going to be an amazing party. Of course, she doesn't get to do any of that, because the moment she is introduced, the reporters swarm her. She doesn't realize why. But then the German businessmen say, here is our chance, immediately dive in, and in their very broken English, start trying to talk to the reporters. The reporters don't speak German at all. Dick Little used to joke that he had two words in German, Ein and Bier. And so she just clicks in to translation mode and spends all night translating for all of these businessmen, but then other Europeans in the room who start wanting to talk to the reporters. So she's flipping through languages, translating all of these people back and forth, and facilitating this hours-long conversation about the war, politics, history, economics, art. They have completely ruined her beautiful, glamorous night out at the ball.
And she loved it.
This was her idea of a good time. A few days later, Dick Little, who was getting very frustrated with the poor quality of the translators he's been able to find, asks her if she'd be interested in a job.
Sort of a combination translator, Girl Friday, cub reporter.
And he promises he's going to train her how to be a reporter.
She didn't even stop to ask how much it paid. She said yes. It just felt like it was the job she'd been training for her entire life.
Now, reading this for the first time, I was bracing myself for the terrible, disappointing reality of what was obviously about to happen. That this man who has promised this wide-eyed, naive young woman a reporter job is obviously just going to turn her into his own personal secretary, maid, who knows what else, and just casually destroy her life. Stick with me, kid. I'll take you right to the top. Tale as old as time. Thankfully, it's not.
Yay!
Because Dick Little is actually a really great guy.
Dick Little was really quite an amazing man. One of his contemporaries described him as a knight of journalism. And so he didn't just use her services as a translator. He actively trained her as a journalist. He teaches her techniques. He emphasizes the importance of accuracy. If you can't verify the source, there's not a story. And not all of his contemporaries at the time believed that. It was still a relatively new idea. But she held to that for the rest of her life.
So he actually did it. He actually trained her to be a journalist. He treated her like a valued colleague. He's putting her bylines in the paper.
Cool.
And soon she is the #2 correspondent in Berlin. And these two become dear friends and colleagues and a sort of a famous comic duo because Dick Little, despite his name, was 6'7".
6'7". Wow.
She's barely 5'2", and had not regained the weight that she had lost in the hungry days of the war. So she's running as fast as she can alongside him as they walk. And often he's on one side and a big German's on the other, and she's translating as fast as she can. So they become really visible. The other thing that she was doing at the same time she was learning to be a journalist is she was learning how to function in this all-male boys' club of foreign correspondents. She had to come to terms with drinking in a bar. It's not that she doesn't drink. Her father spent time educating her palate, actually, so that she knew a lot about wine and had a taste for beer. But respectable women, she had been taught, didn't go to a bar unless they were accompanied by their father or their husband, or if they were playing loose with it, by a brother or a fiancé. But a boss didn't count. And the bar at the Hotel Adlon was pretty much the unofficial clubhouse for foreign correspondents in Berlin. And if she wasn't able to hang out there, she couldn't do her job.
She knows she can't match these men drink for drink at all. And she really needs to be on her game all of the time because she's the only woman in the room. So she cuts a deal with the bartender.
Smart.
He adds a new drink to the menu that is called the Schultz. And when she orders it, it is orange juice with bitters. And when anyone else orders it, it is an extremely stiff drink of orange juice and whatever clear alcohol he has open at the time.
That's brilliant.
So she creates this illusion that she is a hard drinking.
Oh my gosh, I love that.
You know, she's drinking these men under the table when she's not consuming any alcohol at all.
The other thing she did at this time was she and her mother turned their apartment into an alternate social hub. They threw beer evenings, beer ovens, which is very much a German social thing. They also do what they called bean parties, because Mama Schultz's baked beans became sort of famous in Berlin. And everyone went to those parties. Diplomats and German nobility, military officers, artists and intellectuals of all nationalities, other journalists.
As long as they had good table manners, because she wouldn't allow anyone in her home with her mother who couldn't behave themselves. So she is entering that world, the boys' club in the bar, but she's also moving that world to her own territory. This becomes a really carefully calculated tool. It's not just expanding her network and cultivating new sources. She's also very aware that it is much easier to get someone to talk to you when he is in your living room and chatting with your mom than when he's in his office.
Dick Little gets reassigned. And for a number of years, Sigrid plays the same role for a series of other men who move in and out of the Berlin bureau. Partially a Girl Friday, she's doing the translation. Often she's getting the information and they're getting the byline.
She does all the work and they get all the credit.
In 1925, she finally is promoted to Berlin bureau chief. And at that point, most of her contemporaries there admit that she had really been doing the job for a long time. Because often her boss wouldn't even be in Berlin. He'd be out chasing a story somewhere else, and she would get the job. She's starting to tell all the major stories. Because at that point, her career and the rise of the Nazis are in parallel. In 1925, the Nazis really weren't very important. That starts to change in 1929 because the United States stock market crash takes Germany down with it. And that economic crash in Germany is a boon for the Nazis. They have 109,000 members in 1928. They have more than 1 million by 1932. And in 1929, as things are getting rough in Germany, Germans start to say, some Germans, not all Germans, but some Germans start to say, maybe we need a Mussolini of our own. We need a dictator.
She starts writing about them years before the other American papers, and she's pointing out already how dangerous they are, what they're actually saying, what they're pushing for.
And at that point, Hitler he's only one of a handful of the people they're talking about. And as far as she's concerned, he's not the important one. That changes with the Reichstag elections of 1930. She describes those elections as a fight for the soul of Germany. And when she's writing about the different platforms of the different parties that are running, she's giving the Nazis a lot of paper wrenches. And she's already saying they're calling for pogroms. They're saying that if they get in power, they are going to establish a dictatorship. They are not hiding who they are and what they want to do. And she is reporting it at a point when other papers are giving the election a lot of ink, but they're not talking about the different platforms. The Nazis do better than even Hitler expected. And they go from 60 seats to 107 seats. And they're now the most powerful party.
She realizes she has to have a source on the inside. She has to get in to the Nazi circles if she's going to know what's going on and be able to report on it. So she sends her assistant out to find a Nazi with table manners that are good enough that she can bring him back to her house. And her assistant does better than anyone could have expected, because the low-level random Nazi that he brings back is named Hermann Goering.
Wow. Okay.
Of course, will end up being
the mastermind.
Hitler's right-hand man.
And after a couple of very expensive lunches at restaurants, at which Goering, in one case, ate all the snails that the restaurant had in stock, she invites him to a party at the house.
At his first party at her house, he tells her all about what had been the most thrilling event of his life to date, which was during World War I, when he got to kill a French soldier by bayoneting him right through the chest. Best day of his life.
Mm-hmm.
And as Sigrid Schultz writes about this encounter, they confuse manliness with brutality. And that told me everything I needed to know about the Nazis.
She reports step by step the rise to power.
She has a 1931 interview with Hitler in which he lays out exactly what all of his plans are. She publishes this interview and starts warning Americans, like, look what he's saying that he wants to do. He's saying out loud these things, and he means it, and this is what they will do if they get power.
And he keeps those promises or threats when he becomes chancellor, 1933. Only takes them 2 months to unravel all the rights, all the safeguards.
They dismantle all of it in 2 months. Concentration camps start up immediately.
Mm-hmm.
I think, especially in America, we kind of think of this as like a long drawn out, they slowly trickled in. It was not a trickle. It was not slow. It was immediate. They got power and they started doing these things instantly.
They dismantle the newspaper system. Suddenly, there is no German free press. And the foreign correspondents began to learn that it applies to them as well. Their phones are tapped, their mail is read. And at various points, she is threatened. In fact, there's a point at which they try to entrap her. And it's one of my favorite stories in the book. In 1935, a German that her mother doesn't know delivers a package to their apartment. And even though he says she doesn't need to worry about it, she immediately calls Sigrid and says, there's a package here. I don't know if it's important. Sigrid hurries home, opens it, because she's sure it's going to be another effort to entrap her. And sure enough, it's airplane engine designs. And she knows if she's caught with it, she's going to be arrested as a spy. So she tears it all up. She puts it in the fireplace. She stays there until she's sure it's turned to ash. And she's already walking everywhere that she possibly can because the Nazis are starting to cause deadly accidents with automobiles. So she doesn't want to be in an automobile. On her way back to the office, she sees a man whom she has long thought was trying to entrap journalists. And he was accompanied by two men that she describes as shady characters who she suspects of being secret police.
A few days later, Hermann Goering is the guest of honor at a luncheon at the Ford Press Club, and she confronts him there about this whole, not just about what he's doing to her, but about what they're doing to journalists in general. Entrapment, trying to get them arrested, but also everyone is pretty sure secretly having journalists who are overstepping what they see as the lines killed.
And she's like, we're just not that stupid. No one's going to print these stories. You've got to stop this. And he snapped and says, you've never learned to deal with authority. And that's got to be because you're from that crime-ridden city of Chicago. And after that, he and his staff called her that dragon from Chicago.
Oh.
And she wore that name with pride, really, for the rest of her life. So, it gets worse. It definitely gets worse. And she's trying to find ways to get the story out. There's not technically censorship, but there's sort of after the fact reaction.
It's too dangerous for her to be telling these stories because it might get her killed. It certainly would get her arrested. But she has to tell these stories. And she's in this terrible sort of double bind here of if she pushes too far, then she'll be arrested and no one will be telling these stories anymore. But she also can't stand whitewashing any of this or kind of cleaning it up or hiding it. It is really, really bothering her how much she's having to censor herself to get these stories out. So she will sandwich really important pieces of information in the middle of a very innocuous article, hoping that the censors will just read the beginning, skim, this is a puff piece, and not notice what's in there.
In fact, her first instance of reporting on concentration camps, she handles that way. She sends things out in two pieces, hoping that at least part of the story will get there.
She decides eventually she needs a pseudonym because she really cannot report on these most important things without painting a huge target on her back. She has to find a balance so that she can continue to do her work.
Mm-hmm.
The Tribune sent a note to her in Paris, so it would be safe, asking her to write a new report on the night of the Long Knives, which had happened in the summer of 1934. Hitler had basically massacred the SS leadership as well as anyone that he saw as a political rival. So, 1936, the Tribune sends this to Paris. And the people in Paris just don't understand how dangerous it is.
The secretary in the Paris bureau calls her on the phone and reads her the message asking her to write the true story of the night of Long Knives, with apparently just absolutely no idea, no thought in his mind at all that, like, maybe her phones are tapped. Maybe this is putting her in danger. She knows she can't write the story. And she really needs to write this story. She's really worried about the whitewashed, made-up fairy tale of Germany that Americans have been fed. This is right after the Olympics. And American views of Germany have shifted a lot because they believe the beautiful front that Germany has put on during the Olympics in Berlin.
And she just really wanted to attack that wrong-headedness, innocence, but she knew it wouldn't be safe to do it from Berlin. So she decided to take advantage of the fact that she was under surveillance and informed the Chicago Tribune that she couldn't write a new piece. There wasn't any more information. She'd already said everything she had to say. Then she goes to Paris. She writes the story, and she sends it back to Chicago saying, we really don't want to make the tiger any more angry than he already is. So could we run this over somebody else's name? And the name she suggests, and that ultimately gets used, is John Dickson, which is a sly tribute to Dick Little, who she always called her father in journalism, making her Dick's son.
And almost all of her most dangerous stories from this point forward are going to go out under the name John Dickson. She writes some herself so they don't get suspicious, right? She's still pushing the envelope under her own name, but the real stories that would definitely get her killed go out under John Dickson. So she has relocated to Paris so that she can hopefully keep sending out some of these stories. And then in 1939,
Germany comes for Paris.
the Nazis march into Paris. She is still writing. She's also broadcasting on the new Mutual Broadcasting System, the first of its kind news network that sends out news 24 hours a day to the U.S. This has never been done before.
And that included a nightly segment that was from London, Paris, and Berlin. So at midnight, she's at the German broadcasting station, preparing to broadcast live so that it comes to Chicago during people's dinner hours when they're listening to the radio. She has to turn in her script 2 hours ahead of time. So a bank of 3 censors have an ability to cut it up, muck it up, whatever. And it gets harder and harder to get the news out. And she finds ways to get around it. When they won't let her go on press junkets with the mail correspondence, she hires a young man to be her eyes and ears.
Just like she went to law school. Yeah.
Yes, exactly as the Turkish governor did. Then she goes to the railway stations and just listens to all the soldiers coming and going, which actually ends up being a much more accurate representation of the war than anything the Nazi press releases say.
And yet, it gets so hard. At one point, the censors damaged her script so badly that she refused to go on the air. Dead space was better than accepting their changes. The next day, she rewrote that script so that it would get on the air, but she wrote to her mother, I just had to write so lifelessly about things I care about so much that it hurts me. By the end of 1940, it's virtually impossible for reporters to get a story out with any integrity. She left in February 1941, one of the last to get out before it became impossible. And her plan is that she'll go back to Europe in a couple of months, maybe not to Berlin, but that she'll be back reporting on the Nazis. It didn't happen. She became deathly ill. She caught war typhus. She was sick for a number of years.
Finally, she was getting better, feeling well enough to go again. She is just about to go back to Europe, and she gets hit by a cab in New York City. Really severely hurts her leg. And it is 1945 before she is able to go back as a war correspondent, writing for McCall's and the Chicago Tribune.
It's February 1945. She's obviously reporting on the end of the war. the most important war reporting she did was on the death camps and then on the war crimes trials at Felsenbergen and at Dachau. And her experience at Buchenwald really is important. She was one of a group of reporters who were brought to Buchenwald only hours after the Americans liberated the camp. I mean, obviously that was just a harrowing experience, and you and all the listeners know enough details about the camps that I don't need to go through that. But she had a really unusual experience there, again, because of her language abilities, because she could speak directly to the newly released prisoners in a way that the other reporters couldn't. She got to the camp, and one of the prisoners said, "There's a group of men who are in a separate hospital who are dying, and it would matter if they could hear someone tell them in French that the camp has been liberated." So she went. Later said it was the most gruesome thing she'd ever seen. There were bunks 3 stories tall and filled with dying men, and blood and other stuff was dripping down from the top bunks onto the men below. And she realized there was nothing she could do to make them more comfortable. All she could do was say over and over, "You are free." She had a thought, and she said, "I just came from Paris, and the chestnuts are in bloom." And one of the men sat halfway up and reached out for her, and she took his hand, and he said, "Is it true?" And she said, "Yeah, you're free. The American planes are coming." And he said, "The chestnuts are in bloom?" She nodded yes.
And then he died. It's so awful.
The editor wrote to her that it was the most powerful thing he'd ever read. Soon after the Nuremberg trials had started, she was back in the States doing a speaking tour that she had put off twice. And while she was in Chicago, she stopped to speak to Colonel McCormick, the Tribune's owner, which she did whenever she was there. And they were talking about the war crimes trials. And he said, "There's some of our officers who ought to be on trial too." And it just stopped her. And she said, "I'm sorry, but I just can't accept that." They changed the topic. They continued to have a pleasant conversation. But after she left his office, she walked down the stairs to the main editor, by her own accounts, sobbing her head off.
This seems to be what breaks her. She can't cope with that information. No, I won't accept that. I don't accept that. That's not true. She cannot. The only thing that has been keeping her able to cope with all this is...
We are the good guys.
We are the good guys.
Yeah.
And realizing that some of us are bad guys is too much.
Wow.
She went to the editor and she quit. It was really the end of her career. She probably could have gotten a job with another paper as a foreign correspondent, but she was 53. She wasn't in good health. She had an elderly mother. So instead, she cobbled together freelance work. It may have felt a lot like being back in World War I in the gig economy. And she never quite made the transition. The skills that had served her so well in Berlin were not particularly useful as a reporter in America. And the fact that she just never was able to make the switch to knowing that the Soviet Union was the big bad, not Germany, made her a little bit of a political dinosaur. for the next 10 years, she really was still recognized as a German expert.
But we don't need a German expert, really, anymore.
And we don't really want to talk about war anymore.
And she is not willing to talk about it the way people want her to. She wasn't forgotten.
She lived in a little cottage in Westport, Connecticut that she'd purchased for her mother in 1938 when she wanted to get her mother out of Germany. And so she was in this cottage surrounded by cats and piles of half-written articles and books that she'd started. And people came to find her. Journalists and historians and people who were interested in what it was like to be in Berlin and what it was like to work for Colonel McCormick and what it was like to be a woman correspondent. And those people had no doubt of the charm and the intelligence and just the sheer power of her personality.
But she makes them uncomfortable. She can't stop warning people that Germany will do it again if we give them a chance. They mustn't be allowed to ever regain enough power to do it again. And she's sort of seen as this, like, kooky old obsessive who can't let it go.
Yeah. Interesting.
She can't move with the times.
Can't move on. Yeah.
Her entire career been willing to whitewash. You know, she would rather not publish the story than publish a prettified version of what she believes to be true. And she won't do it now. She won't say things that she doesn't believe.
What she always reminds me of is Ulysses S. Grant, where he's absolutely perfectly designed for one moment in time. And she is absolutely perfect for the time and the place at which she flourishes. He never quite found his feet again, and neither did she.
She was so perfectly designed for that moment to be an American correspondent in Berlin during the war. Her genre has disappeared.
Yeah.
Her skills are no longer needed. But looking back, we can see her work was so crucial in helping turn the tide of opinion in the U.S. against Nazi Germany, telling the truth when most other papers were not interested in these weird little men. They were doing puff pieces, or they were mocking people who were taking the Nazi party seriously. And she was one of the first and only to start raising that alarm early on. We owe her a massive debt, I think, as a world. And the first step to repaying that is remembering her name. And luckily, Pam Toler's book makes that very easy because it is a wonderful read. Funny, heartbreaking, thoughtful, infuriating, beautiful. And I really hope it will help remind everyone how important she was.
In one of those interviews, close to the end of her life, she told the interviewer, "You know, talking to you just makes me feel a little bit more alive." And his answer was, "Sigrid, there's nobody more alive than you."
Huge thanks to Pam Toler. On our website, What'sHerNamePodcast.com, you can find pictures, resources, and more.
You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook, where we post lots of photos each week. Our theme song was composed and performed by Daniel Foster Smith.
Our intern is Katie Boucher.
What's Her Name is produced by Olivia Mickle and Katie Nelson, and this episode was edited by Olivia Mickle.